Sometimes the greatest test of a person's heart begins the moment they believe no one is watching. By the time Ethan Brooks finished his 27th blind date, the coffee in front of him had already gone cold. The woman sitting across from him forced an apologetic smile, glanced once more through the diner's front window at his aging silver pickup with faded paint, and quietly gathered her designer handbag. "I'm sorry," she said, avoiding his eyes. "I just remembered I promised my sister I'd call her tonight." Ethan nodded gently. "I hope everything's okay." "I'm sure it is." She stood, offered a polite wave, and disappeared into the cool Colorado evening without looking back. Ethan didn't chase after her. He never did. He simply folded the paper napkin beside his untouched slice of apple pie and smiled the kind of smile only people who had learned to survive disappointment could wear. Around him, the evening crowd continued as if nothing had happened. Forks tapped against ceramic plates. A country song drifted softly from an old jukebox tucked beside the entrance. Fresh coffee filled the air with a warm, familiar aroma that somehow made loneliness feel even quieter. Sunset Diner had become his favorite place for failed first dates. The staff never asked questions. They simply welcomed him back with the same kindness every Thursday evening. Ethan checked the time on his worn leather watch. 7:42. Plenty of time to pick up Lily from his sister's house before bedtime. His 8-year-old daughter would ask the same question she asked after every blind date. "Did she like you this time, Dad?" He always answered with the same gentle laugh. "She just wasn't the right person." The truth was more complicated than that. Ethan Brooks wasn't broke. Not even close. Less than 3 months earlier, he had quietly finalized the sale of one of the largest regional logistics companies in the western United States. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Business podcasts praised his instincts. His bank account could buy almost anything he wanted. Everything except certainty that someone could love him without first falling in love with his money. Since losing his wife 5 years earlier, wealth had become something he carried like invisible luggage. Every introduction seemed to change the moment someone searched his name online. Every smile felt slightly rehearsed. Every compliment sounded just a little too polished. So he stopped telling people who he was. Old truck. Simple clothes. No expensive watch. No private driver. No mention of boardrooms, investors, or 8-figure contracts. Just Ethan. Just a father hoping someone might see the man before the fortune. "Looks like today wasn't your lucky day either." The soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up. A young waitress stood beside the booth balancing a fresh pot of coffee in one hand and a small plate in the other. Her name tag read Grace Sullivan. She couldn't have been older than 30. Auburn hair rested loosely over one shoulder, and a few freckles across her cheeks caught the warm glow of the hanging lights. She placed a slice of homemade apple pie in front of him before he could object. "Kitchen made an extra one," she said with a gentle shrug. "Seems a shame to let good pie go to waste." Ethan smiled. "I didn't order this." "I know." She smiled back. "Some people need dessert more than explanations." For the first time in months, Ethan laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Neither of them noticed the elderly couple seated quietly across the room exchanging knowing smiles. And neither of them could have imagined that this ordinary Thursday night inside a small roadside diner was about to become the beginning of a story neither money nor fate had ever managed to write. The bell above the diner's front door chimed softly as Ethan stepped outside carrying the untouched slice of pie in a small cardboard box. The evening air felt crisp, carrying the scent of pine trees from the hills beyond town. He reached his old pickup truck, paused with one hand on the weathered door, and glanced back through the front window. Grace had already returned to work, smiling warmly as she refilled an elderly customer's coffee without being asked. She moved through the dining room with an ease that could never be rehearsed. There was no performance in her kindness. No expectation of applause. She simply noticed people. Ethan had almost forgotten what that looked like. 20 minutes later he parked outside his sister Hannah's house. The porch light glowed against the deep blue evening sky, and before he could knock, the front door flew open. 8-year-old Lily rushed outside wearing mismatched socks and a bright yellow sweatshirt. "Daddy!" she shouted, throwing her arms around him. Ethan hugged her tightly and kissed the top of her head. "Did you have fun?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "And Hannah let me make chocolate chip pancakes for dinner." Hannah leaned against the doorway with a knowing smile. "How did tonight go?" she asked quietly. Ethan laughed under his breath. "Exactly like the last 26. Hannah folded her arms. "You know, one day you could simply tell someone who you are." Ethan looked toward the truck before answering. "I have tried that." His voice remained calm. "When they know my last name before they know my heart, everything changes." Hannah sighed because she had heard those words many times before. She also knew they came from years of disappointment rather than bitterness. During the drive home, Lily noticed the white bakery box resting on the passenger seat. "Pie?" she asked hopefully. Ethan smiled. "A waitress insisted I take it." Lily's eyes widened. "For free?" "For free. Maybe she felt sorry for you." Ethan laughed louder this time. "That is entirely possible." Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. "Or maybe she thought you looked lonely." Those simple words settled quietly inside him. Children often saw truths adults spent years trying to hide. Back at their modest farmhouse on the edge of town, Ethan tucked Lily into bed beneath a handmade quilt that had once belonged to her mother. Family photographs lined the dresser. Some were faded from years in the afternoon sunlight, but none had ever been moved. Lily held the stuffed rabbit she had carried almost everywhere since preschool. "Did the lady at dinner seem nice?" she whispered. Ethan hesitated. "She did. Did she ask about me?" "No." "That is good." Lily smiled sleepily. "If someone likes you before they know about me, maybe they will like both of us later." Ethan gently brushed a strand of blonde hair away from her forehead. "That is exactly how it should happen." After she fell asleep, the house settled into its familiar silence. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Outside, crickets filled the darkness with their quiet chorus. Ethan walked into the kitchen, opened his laptop, and within seconds the screen displayed financial reports, investment updates, and messages from executives in 3 different states. One email requested his approval on a commercial property worth more than $20 million. Another outlined a meeting with venture partners scheduled for Monday morning in Denver. He closed the computer without answering either message. None of it mattered tonight. His thoughts kept returning to a waitress who had offered pie instead of pity. Meanwhile, Grace finished wiping down the last booth inside Sunset Diner. Her manager counted receipts while the dishwasher hummed in the background. "You gave away another slice of pie," her coworker Melissa teased. Grace shrugged as she tied her apron strings. He looked like he needed someone to believe the evening was not a complete waste. Melissa laughed. "You have a habit of adopting strangers." Grace smiled softly. "Maybe everybody needs one person who expects nothing from them." As she locked the front door behind her, she noticed the empty booth where Ethan had been sitting. Something about the quiet father with tired eyes lingered in her thoughts longer than she expected. Neither of them realized they were carrying home far more than an ordinary Thursday night. One carried a secret fortune. The other carried a quiet compassion that money had never been able to buy. And somewhere between those two unseen truths, fate had already begun writing the next chapter. Saturday arrived wrapped in bright autumn sunshine, and the little town square buzzed with the easy rhythm of a weekend farmer's market. Children chased one another between handmade craft booths while musicians played familiar country songs beneath strings of white lights that still hung from the previous festival. Ethan held Lily's hand as they wandered slowly past fresh pumpkins, homemade jams, and baskets overflowing with crisp apples. For the first time in weeks, he had not scheduled a meeting, answered a business call, or glanced at the financial news. Today belonged entirely to his daughter. Lily stopped suddenly beside a table covered with hand-painted birdhouses. "Daddy, can we make one like this someday?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "I think we can do even better than that." Before Lily could answer, another familiar voice floated through the crowd. Well, if it is not my favorite customer who never finishes his pie. Ethan turned. Grace stood beside a booth selling fresh flowers, holding a paper bag filled with vegetables and a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. She wore blue jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and comfortable sneakers. Without the diner uniform, she looked even more relaxed, like someone who belonged wherever kindness was needed. Lily looked curiously at her father before smiling politely. Grace knelt slightly to meet her eyes. You must be Lily. The little girl blinked. How did you know my name? Grace laughed softly. Your father smiled differently when he talked about you. Ethan felt unexpectedly embarrassed. I guess I mention her more than I realize. That is usually a good sign, Grace replied. Lily studied Grace for another moment before holding out her hand with surprising confidence. It is nice to meet you. Grace shook it gently. It is nice to meet you too. They ended up walking together through the market almost by accident. Lily insisted on showing Grace every booth that caught her attention. They sampled local honey, watched a glass artist shape colorful ornaments, and laughed when a friendly golden retriever decided Lily's shoelaces looked like toys. Ethan mostly listened. Grace never tried to impress anyone. She asked Lily about school instead of grades. She asked what books she liked instead of what television shows she watched. When Lily proudly explained that she wanted to become a veterinarian because every animal deserved someone to care about it, Grace nodded with complete sincerity. The world could always use another kind heart, she said. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Grace never asked where he worked. She never asked what kind of house he owned or what neighborhood he lived in. She seemed perfectly content discussing apple cider, children's books, and the changing leaves. It felt almost unfamiliar. Near lunchtime, Lily spotted a face-painting booth. Daddy, please? Ethan reached into his wallet, but Grace gently stopped him. My treat, she said. You already bought the apple cider. Ethan smiled. You really do not have to. I know. She shrugged. I want to. 15 minutes later, Lily returned with a beautifully painted butterfly across her cheeks, grinning from ear to ear. She grabbed both Ethan's hand and Grace's without thinking, happily pulling them toward the small park beside the courthouse where families gathered beneath towering maple trees. Grace looked down briefly at Lily's tiny hand wrapped around hers, then at Ethan. Either of them spoke. They simply shared a quiet smile that carried more warmth than many conversations ever could. As the afternoon sun filtered through branches glowing with shades of red and gold, Ethan felt something inside him begin to soften. For years he had measured every new relationship by the moment someone discovered his wealth. With Grace, there had been no curiosity about his finances, no carefully disguised questions, no sudden change in behavior. She saw only a father spending Saturday with his daughter. And somehow, that simple truth felt more valuable than every business success he had ever achieved. While they watched Lily chase falling leaves across the grass, Grace whispered almost absent-mindedly. She is a wonderful little girl. Ethan answered quietly. She is the best part of my life. Grace smiled without looking away from Lily. I can tell. Neither of them realized that the strongest connections are rarely built through grand gestures. Sometimes they begin with homemade pie, a Saturday morning, and two people who choose to notice the goodness quietly growing between them. The weeks that followed slipped quietly into a rhythm that none of them had planned and none of them wanted to interrupt. Every Wednesday evening, Ethan found a reason to stop by Sunset Diner after picking Lily up from school. Sometimes he ordered nothing more than coffee. Sometimes Lily insisted they split a grilled cheese sandwich and a slice of apple pie. It was never really about the food. It became about the familiar smile waiting behind the counter. Grace never greeted Ethan with exaggerated excitement, and somehow that made every conversation feel more genuine. You two are becoming regulars, she joked one evening as she set down 3 glasses of lemonade instead of 2. Lily grinned. Does that mean we get our own booth? Grace laughed. I think booth number 6 has already adopted you. The little booth beside the front window slowly became their place. Outside, traffic rolled lazily through the small town. Inside, warm lights reflected across polished wood tables while quiet country music floated through the dining room. The familiar sounds of silverware, laughter, and fresh coffee blended into something that felt remarkably close to home. Ethan found himself sharing stories he had not told anyone in years. He spoke about teaching Lily to ride a bicycle. He described their annual tradition of decorating Christmas cookies even though either of them could frost them neatly. He admitted that he still burned pancakes almost every Saturday morning. Grace laughed so hard at that confession that nearby customers smiled without knowing why. "You are telling me a grown man who can rebuild a birdhouse cannot cook pancakes?" she teased. Ethan shrugged dramatically. "I never claimed to have every talent." Lily joined in immediately. "He sets off the smoke detector at least once a month." Ethan pretended to look offended. "Twice a month is an exaggeration." Grace shook her head, still smiling. "I think honesty is becoming my favorite thing about both of you." On her days off, Grace occasionally joined them for simple outings that cost almost nothing. They walked through the public library where Lily proudly introduced Grace to every librarian by name. They spent an afternoon feeding ducks at the lake while autumn leaves drifted across the water like tiny golden boats. One Saturday they packed peanut butter sandwiches, homemade cookies, and bottled lemonade before hiking an easy trail through Pine Ridge Park. From the overlook they could see miles of colorful forests stretching beneath a bright blue sky. Lily collected smooth rocks while Ethan and Grace sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the valley. "Do you ever wish life had turned out differently?" Grace asked softly. Ethan considered the question carefully. "There are things I wish had never happened," he admitted. "But if changing my past meant losing even one day with Lily, I would not change anything." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes remaining on the mountains in the distance. "That sounds like something my mother would say." Ethan noticed there was always warmth in Grace's voice whenever she mentioned her mother. There was affection, but also responsibility. She never complained, yet it was obvious she carried burdens she rarely discussed. He wanted to ask more, but experience had taught him that trust grew best when it was never rushed. As the afternoon breeze carried the scent of pine through the trees, Lily suddenly appeared holding 3 small stones. "Friendship rocks," she announced proudly. She handed one to Ethan, one to Grace, and slipped the third into her own pocket. Each stone had been marked with a tiny heart using a red marker she carried in her backpack. Grace looked at hers and smiled with genuine surprise. "I have never received a friendship rock before." Lily shrugged matter-of-factly. "Now you have." Grace carefully tucked the stone into her sweater pocket, as though it were something precious. Ethan watched the exchange without saying a word. Money had purchased rare paintings, luxury vehicles, and private flights throughout his career. Yet none of those things had ever carried the quiet value of a child's hand drawing a tiny red heart onto an ordinary stone. Walking back toward the parking lot, Grace slipped naturally beside Ethan while Lily skipped several steps ahead, humming happily to herself. Neither adult reached for the other's hand. Neither spoke about the growing affection quietly settling between them. They simply walked at the same comfortable pace beneath a canopy of amber leaves, discovering that sometimes the deepest connections are built not through grand declarations but through ordinary days shared with extraordinary sincerity. By the time November settled over the valley, the trees had surrendered most of their leaves, and the morning air carried the unmistakable promise of winter. Life continued with the quiet steadiness that Ethan had begun to treasure. Every morning started with breakfast beside Lily before school. Every afternoon ended with homework spread across the kitchen table. Every Wednesday seemed to find its way back to Sunset Diner, where Grace greeted them with the same sincere smile that had never once felt rehearsed. It was almost enough to make Ethan believe that perhaps ordinary happiness had finally found its way back into his life. Grace felt it too, although she rarely spoke about it. Her coworkers noticed she smiled more often. She hummed while refilling coffee cups. Even the regular customers commented that she looked lighter somehow. One Friday evening, after her shift ended, Melissa invited her to dinner with several friends from town. Grace accepted without much thought. The restaurant buzzed with weekend conversation as everyone shared stories about work, family, and holiday plans. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward relationships. Melissa smiled knowingly. "So tell us about this guy from the diner." Grace laughed softly. "There is not much to tell." "There has to be," another friend insisted. "You smile every time someone mentions his name." Grace looked down at her glass before answering. "He is kind. He is patient. He is a wonderful father." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "What does he do?" Grace hesitated. "I actually do not know." The table fell unusually quiet. "You have been seeing him for almost 2 months, and you do not know where he works?" someone asked in disbelief. Grace shrugged. "It never seemed important." Melissa leaned forward. "Grace, I love you, but that is exactly why you get taken advantage of. You always believe the best about people. He has never given me a reason not to." "Maybe not yet." Another friend spoke gently. "Does he own his house?" Grace smiled faintly. "I have never asked." "How much does he make?" "I have never asked that either." Melissa sighed. "Grace, kindness is wonderful, but bills still have to be paid. You have been working 2 jobs for years because your mother's medical expenses never stop. You cannot build a future on good intentions alone." Grace remained silent. Those words stayed with her long after dinner ended. Driving home through the quiet streets, she found herself replaying every conversation she had shared with Ethan. She realized she truly knew very little about his career, his finances, or even what he did during weekdays while Lily was in school. For the first time, uncertainty quietly entered a place where trust had been growing. The following Wednesday, Ethan noticed a difference almost immediately. Grace still smiled, but it carried the weight of unasked questions. She seemed distracted while serving customers, apologizing twice for forgetting simple orders, something she almost never did. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked after Lily wandered toward the dessert display with another customer. Grace nodded automatically. "Just tired." Ethan studied her expression. "You are a very poor liar." She laughed softly, but the laughter faded quickly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She folded her hands together, almost embarrassed. "What do you actually do for work?" Ethan felt the question settle heavily between them. It was the moment he had quietly dreaded from the beginning. Not because she had asked, but because every answer seemed incomplete. If he revealed everything now, would she wonder whether every simple afternoon had been carefully staged? If he continued hiding the truth, would silence slowly become dishonesty? He chose the safest part of the truth. "I invest in a few businesses," he answered calmly. "Mostly from home these days." Grace nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she sensed there was more he was not saying. Before either of them could continue, Lily returned carrying 3 tiny sugar cookies decorated like snowflakes. "Good news," she announced proudly. "The baker said these were the last ones, so I saved one for everybody." Grace accepted hers with a grateful smile. Ethan did the same. For a few moments, the conversation returned to laughter, but beneath the warmth, a quiet tension had begun to grow. Neither of them realized that the smallest unanswered question can sometimes become the loudest silence in a relationship, especially when 2 honest hearts are trying equally hard to protect one another. 3 days later, the first snow of the season dusted the rooftops, leaving the town wrapped in a quiet white stillness. Ethan had just finished helping Lily build a small snowman in the front yard when his phone vibrated. The screen displayed Grace's name. She almost never called during the day. He answered immediately. "Grace?" There was a pause before she spoke. "I'm sorry to bother you." Her voice sounded calm, but beneath it he heard something far heavier. "You are never a bother." "What happened?" She took a slow breath. "My mother became sick this morning. Her doctor wants to run more tests at the regional medical center. They think she should stay for a few days." Ethan's expression softened. "Is she all right?" "They believe she will be. They just want to be careful." She tried to sound reassuring, yet exhaustion quietly slipped into every sentence. I have been at the hospital since 6 o'clock this morning. Have you eaten? Ethan asked. Grace laughed weakly. That sounds exactly like something my mother would ask. I am serious. Not really. Stay where you are. Ethan, you do not have to. Please. 30 minutes later, Ethan walked into the hospital carrying 2 cups of hot chicken noodle soup, fresh bread from the local bakery, and a paper bag filled with fruit. Lily insisted on coming too and had carefully packed one of her friendship rocks inside the bag. Grace looked surprised when she saw them walking through the waiting area. The fluorescent lights reflected softly across polished floors while distant conversations blended with the gentle hum of medical equipment. Ethan handed her the soup without saying anything dramatic. Grace looked at the warm container in her hands and smiled for the first time that day. You remembered my favorite. Ethan shrugged gently. I asked Melissa once. Grace looked at him with quiet disbelief. You remembered something I mentioned weeks ago? The important things are usually worth remembering. Lily reached into the paper bag and held out the small stone with another tiny red heart drawn across it. Grandma Grace needs one too. Grace blinked, surprised by the unexpected gift. Grandma Grace? Lily's cheeks turned pink. Well, I do not know what else to call her because she raised you. Grace laughed through eyes that suddenly shimmered with emotion. I think she would love that very much. They spent the next hour talking about ordinary things instead of medical appointments. Lily described her science project. Ethan shared another story about his latest attempt to make pancakes without setting off the smoke detector. Even Grace began laughing again. For a little while the waiting room felt less frightening. Later that afternoon, a financial counselor quietly approached Grace with several documents explaining estimated costs for additional examinations and treatment. Grace thanked the woman politely, but Ethan noticed the color slowly leave her face as she read the numbers. After the counselor walked away, Grace folded the papers carefully and slipped them into her purse without saying a word. Ethan did not ask to see them. He simply noticed the way her shoulders became heavier. As evening approached, Grace insisted they go home. You have already done more than enough. Ethan looked at her gently. If you need anything at all, call me. She smiled gratefully. I will. She meant it, but deep inside she had already decided she would never ask him for money. She knew he worked hard for everything he had. Whatever he earned, it was his responsibility to provide for Lily first. She would find another solution somehow. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone in the quiet kitchen staring at his phone. Hannah walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea. One look at her brother told her something was wrong. Grace? She asked softly. Ethan nodded. Her mother needs expensive treatment. Hannah sat beside him. Are you going to tell her the truth? Ethan remained silent for several long moments before answering. Not yet. Then what are you going to do? Ethan looked toward the family photograph hanging above the fireplace. His late wife had always believed that kindness mattered most when nobody knew where it came from. A peaceful smile slowly crossed his face. I am going to help, he said quietly. She just cannot ever know it came from me. Outside, fresh snow continued falling across the sleeping town, covering roads, rooftops, and footprints alike, while somewhere beyond the silent darkness, destiny had already begun moving pieces neither Ethan nor Grace could yet see. The following Monday began with an unexpected phone call that left Grace standing perfectly still in the hospital corridor. She had just finished speaking with her mother's physician when the billing office asked her to stop by before leaving. Every step toward the small administrative office felt heavier than the last. She had spent the entire weekend calculating expenses, wondering which extra shifts she could pick up and what belongings she might quietly sell without worrying her mother. The receptionist smiled warmly as Grace approached the counter. Miss Sullivan? Grace nodded. The woman typed a few notes into her computer, paused for a moment, and then looked back with genuine surprise. It looks like your mother's account has been updated this morning. Grace frowned. Updated? Yes. The receptionist clicked through another screen. The outstanding balance has been paid in full, including the additional procedures your physician recommended. Grace stared at her in confusion. There has to be a mistake. I do not believe so. The receptionist turned the monitor slightly. Everything cleared about an hour ago. Grace's heartbeat quickened. Who made the payment? The woman checked again before shaking her head apologetically. The donor requested complete privacy. Grace stood speechless. Can you at least tell me if it was someone from the hospital? I am sorry. I truly cannot. Grace thanked her politely and stepped back into the hallway carrying more questions than answers. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, reflecting softly across the polished floor. Nurses hurried past with warm smiles, families embraced one another near the elevators, and somewhere a newborn cried for the very first time. Life continued around her, yet she remained frozen, unable to understand why a stranger would offer such extraordinary kindness without asking for recognition. Later that afternoon, Ethan received a brief text from an attorney who had quietly arranged the anonymous payment through a charitable foundation he often used for private giving. Everything has been completed exactly as requested. No identifying information has been released. Ethan looked at the message for several seconds before deleting it. He felt no satisfaction from the transaction itself. Money had simply solved the problem. What mattered far more to him was that Grace would have one less burden to carry while caring for her mother. That evening Ethan stopped by the diner as usual with Lily after school. Grace greeted them with a smile that looked brighter than it had in days, yet there was also unmistakable wonder in her expression. Something good happened, Lily observed immediately. Grace laughed. Is it that obvious? Very. Grace poured hot chocolate for Lily before sitting across from Ethan during her short break. Someone paid every one of my mother's medical bills. Ethan widened his eyes with convincing surprise. That is incredible. I still cannot believe it. She shook her head slowly. The hospital will not tell me who did it. Lily smiled brightly. Maybe it was an angel. Grace reached across the table and gently squeezed Lily's hand. Maybe it was. Ethan remained quiet, watching the warmth return to Grace's face for the first time in weeks. She looked lighter somehow, as though hope itself had become easier to carry. For a moment he wondered whether telling her the truth would steal something beautiful from the simple goodness of the gift. He decided it would. Some acts of kindness deserved to remain quiet. 2 mornings later Ethan drove into downtown Denver before sunrise for the first executive meeting he had attended in nearly 2 months. His headquarters occupied the upper floors of a modern glass building overlooking the city. He wore a tailored navy suit instead of his usual flannel shirt, and the old pickup truck remained parked at home while a company vehicle met him outside the airport. As he entered the lobby, employees crossing the marble floor immediately straightened. Conversations paused. Security officers smiled respectfully. Executives waiting near the elevators greeted him with quiet confidence. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Welcome back, sir. We are glad to have you here. Ethan acknowledged each greeting with the same humility he showed everyone else. He listened more than he spoke. He thanked the receptionist by name. He asked about an employee's newborn son before stepping into the private elevator. High above the city, a photographer from a regional business magazine captured a few images for an article celebrating the company's recent expansion. Ethan almost forgot the photographs had even been taken. Meanwhile, back in the small town, Grace finished another busy lunch shift before Melissa hurried into the break room carrying her phone. Grace, she called excitedly. You are not going to believe who is on the front page of today's business section. Grace accepted the phone without much interest. Then her eyes slowly widened as she recognized a familiar smile beneath the headline. The man standing confidently in an expensive suit before an entire boardroom looked exactly like the father who laughed about burnt pancakes and drove an aging pickup truck. Grace whispered only 3 words before the room fell completely silent. Ethan Brooks, why? Grace stared at the photograph until the words beneath it finally came into focus. Ethan Brooks. Founder. Chairman. Entrepreneur of the Year. The article described a man who had quietly built one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country before selling it for a fortune that most people could scarcely imagine. There were photographs of him standing beside governors, business leaders, and community organizations. Another image showed him receiving an award for anonymous charitable giving. Grace slowly lowered the phone, her heartbeat louder than the chatter inside. The break room. Melissa looked at her with wide eyes. That is him, is not it? Grace nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes. Grace, he is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She remained silent. Every memory from the past 2 months replayed itself in her mind with startling clarity. The old pickup truck. The simple flannel shirts. The homemade sandwiches. The quiet hikes. The laughter over burnt pancakes. None of it suddenly felt fake. Yet one undeniable truth stood between every beautiful memory. He had never told her who he really was. Grace finished her shift without saying much to anyone. Outside, light snow drifted lazily through the afternoon sky as she sat inside her car with the engine turned off. She looked again at the article before placing the phone gently on the passenger seat. Why? She whispered to the empty car. That evening Ethan arrived at Sunset Diner at the usual time with Lily beside him, both of them carrying scarves dusted with fresh snowflakes. The familiar warmth inside the restaurant greeted them immediately, but something felt different. Booth number 6 was empty. Grace was standing near the coffee station, and when their eyes met, she smiled politely. It was kind. It was respectful. But it no longer carried the effortless warmth he had come to cherish. Ethan knew instantly that she had learned the truth. Grace walked toward them carrying menus she knew they would never need. Good evening, she said quietly. Lily smiled brightly. Hi, Grace. Grace bent down and hugged Lily gently. Hello, sweetheart. Then she looked back at Ethan. Could we talk after my shift? Ethan answered softly. Of course. For the next hour, conversation never quite found its usual rhythm. Lily happily described rehearsals for the school Christmas concert while Grace listened with genuine affection, yet every time Ethan glanced toward her, he could see the questions she was patiently holding back. When the diner finally closed, snow covered the sidewalks outside in a smooth white blanket. Streetlights reflected softly across the quiet pavement as Grace stepped outside, wrapping her coat tightly against the cold. Ethan stood waiting beside the old pickup truck. Either of them spoke for several moments. Only the distant sound of passing traffic interrupted the silence. Finally Grace looked at him. You are Ethan Brooks? He nodded. Yes. The Ethan Brooks? Yes. She searched his face, almost hoping she might somehow be mistaken. You told me you invested in a few businesses. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. That was true. It just was not the whole truth. He took a slow breath. No. Grace folded her arms, not from anger but from the cold and from the emotions she was struggling to organize. I have spent weeks wondering whether I was asking too much from a man who worked hard every day just to provide for his daughter. She looked at him steadily. All that time, you could have bought this entire town. Ethan shook his head gently. That was never what mattered. Then why? Her voice remained calm, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. Why hide everything? Ethan looked toward the quiet diner before answering. Because every time I stopped hiding it, people stopped seeing me. Grace remained silent. He continued carefully. After my wife passed away, I tried being honest from the beginning. Every introduction changed the moment someone recognized my name. Conversations became interviews. Affection became calculation. I never knew whether anyone wanted Ethan or simply the life they imagined came with him. Snowflakes settled quietly across his shoulders as he spoke. So I stopped introducing myself as a businessman. I started introducing myself as Lily's father. Grace listened without interrupting. Then I met you, Ethan said softly. You never asked what I owned. You cared whether Lily had finished her homework. You laughed at my terrible pancakes. You treated me exactly the same on the first day as you did on the last. Grace looked down at the friendship rock Lily had once given her, still resting inside her coat pocket. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Every single day. I just kept hoping to find the right moment before my past ruined something beautiful." Grace slowly lifted her eyes to meet his once more. Either of them noticed that the snowfall had become heavier, gently covering the ground around them, while between two honest hearts standing beneath the winter sky, the hardest conversation of all had finally begun. Grace did not answer that night. She simply wished Ethan good night, walked to her car, and drove home through the quiet snowfall with more questions than she had ever carried before. Yet the days that followed slowly accomplished what explanations alone never could. She remembered every conversation they had shared, every simple afternoon in the park, every laugh over burnt pancakes, every moment Ethan had chosen kindness when no reward could possibly follow. The man she had come to admire had never disappeared. She had simply learned another chapter of his life. A week later, Grace's mother was finally discharged from the hospital. Her strength had begun returning, and although recovery would take time, hope had settled gently back into their family. As Grace helped her mother into the living room, the older woman noticed the friendship rock resting on the bookshelf. She picked it up and smiled. "The little girl gave you this, did not she?" Grace nodded. "Yes. You have been carrying that stone everywhere." Grace laughed quietly. "I guess I have." Her mother studied her daughter for a long moment. "You are trying to decide whether someone hid the truth because they wanted to deceive you, or because they were afraid of losing something precious." Grace looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I have lived long enough to recognize the difference." She gently placed the little stone back onto the shelf. "Character usually reveals itself long before money does." Those words stayed with Grace throughout the weekend. On Sunday afternoon, she drove to the small farmhouse without calling first. Ethan was outside helping Lily hang handmade bird feeders along the old oak tree in the front yard. Lily spotted Grace first. "Grace!" she shouted happily before running across the snow-covered grass. Grace knelt and hugged her tightly. Ethan walked toward them slowly, uncertain what the afternoon would bring. "Hi," he said quietly. Grace smiled, and this time the warmth had returned to her eyes. "Hi." For several moments none of them spoke. Winter sunlight reflected across the fresh snow, making the entire yard glow with peaceful brightness. Birds fluttered between bare branches while smoke drifted lazily from a neighboring chimney. It felt like the kind of afternoon that asked people to be honest. Grace finally broke the silence. "I spent days asking myself whether I knew the real Ethan Brooks." He listened without interrupting. "Then I realized something." She looked directly into his eyes. "The man who carried soup into a hospital waiting room was real. The father who let his daughter paint butterflies on his face during a school fundraiser was real. The man who listened instead of showing off, who remembered my favorite soup, who never made anyone feel small, that man was always real." Ethan felt emotion quietly rise in his chest. Grace continued softly. "Your bank account was the secret. Your character never was." Ethan lowered his head for a moment before looking back at her. "I should have trusted you sooner." "Maybe." She smiled gently. "And maybe I should have trusted that good people sometimes carry difficult stories." Lily looked back and forth between them with obvious curiosity before asking the question only a child would ask. "So, does this mean we are all friends again?" Grace laughed through happy tears. "I certainly hope so." Lily reached out and grabbed one of Grace's hands before taking Ethan's with the other, proudly joining them together. Neither adult pulled away. A few weeks later, just before Christmas, Sunset Diner closed early for its annual holiday dinner. Regular customers, employees, neighbors, and friends gathered beneath twinkling lights while soft Christmas music filled the room. Ethan stood beside booth number 6 holding a small velvet box. There were no reporters, no executives, no expensive ballroom, only the people who had quietly become family. He looked at Grace with the same sincerity she had first seen on the night of his 27th failed blind date. I cannot promise that life will always be easy, he said. But I can promise that I will always choose honesty, kindness, and you. Grace. Sullivan, will you marry me? Grace smiled through tears that reflected the warm lights above them. Yes, she whispered. Not because you are wealthy. Not because of your success. I said yes to the same man I met over a slice of apple pie. Applause filled the little diner as Ethan gently placed the ring on her finger. Lily wrapped both of them in the biggest hug her small arms could manage before looking up with the brightest smile in the room. Can I call you Mom someday? Grace knelt beside her, gently brushed a strand of hair behind Lily's ear, and answered with quiet love. Whenever your heart is ready. In that ordinary little diner where strangers had once crossed paths over coffee and pie, everyone fell silent for just a moment, because they understood something that money could never purchase. Fortune may open doors, but it is quiet dignity, faithful character, second chances, and genuine love that build a home.